Sarah Martinez had been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 8 years, but she had never experienced a morning quite like this one. The September air carried a crisp bite that made her breath visible in small puffs as she walked along the remote Cascade Trail. Her radio crackled softly on her shoulder, the morning check-ins from other rangers creating a comforting background noise in the wilderness silence. She loved these early morning patrols. The tourists hadn't yet arrived in large numbers, and the wildlife moved freely through the landscape. This particular section of the park was one of her favorites because it required a steep hike that deterred casual visitors, leaving the area pristine and wild. The trail wound through dense forest before opening up to breathtaking views of the canyon below. Sarah stopped to adjust her heavy pack, which contained emergency medical supplies, rope, flares, and enough food and water for a full day in the backcountry. Her supervisor had assigned her to check on reports of illegal camping in the area. Some visitors had been spotted setting up tents near the canyon edge, despite clear warnings about the unstable ground and dangerous cliff faces. As she continued along the narrow path, Sarah noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth. They led directly toward the restricted area near Devil's Overlook, a particularly treacherous section where the ground jutted out over a 300-foot drop. The rocky ledge had been the site of several accidents over the years, and park management had installed multiple warning signs and barriers to keep people away. The boot prints were recent, probably from the night before. Sarah quickened her pace, concerned that someone might still be camping in the dangerous area. As a ranger, she had seen too many preventable accidents caused by people who ignored safety warnings in pursuit of the perfect photograph or camping spot. The trail became increasingly steep as it approached the overlook. Sarah had to grab onto tree branches and rock outcroppings to maintain her balance on the slippery path. The recent autumn rains had made the ground treacherous, and she could see where sections of the trail had begun to erode away completely. When she reached the restricted area, Sarah immediately spotted the evidence of illegal camping. A fire ring made of stacked stones sat dangerously close to the cliff edge, surrounded by trampled vegetation and scattered trash. Whoever had been here had clearly ignored all the posted warnings about the unstable ground. Sarah pulled out her notebook to document the violation and began taking photographs for her report. As she moved closer to the fire ring to collect the trash, she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. It was a low rumbling like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath her feet. She looked down and noticed hairline cracks in the rocky ground around the fire ring. The illegal campfire had been built directly on a section of overhanging rock that was already weakened by years of erosion. The heat from the fire had likely expanded and contracted the stone, creating additional stress fractures. Sarah immediately began backing away from the unstable area, but as she stepped backward, she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her right foot. She tried to distribute her weight more evenly, but it was too late. The sound of cracking stone filled the air, and suddenly the entire section of overlook began to collapse. In the seconds that followed, Sarah's training kicked in. She threw herself backward, trying to get away from the crumbling edge, but her heavy pack threw off her balance. As the rocky ledge gave way completely, Sarah found herself falling toward the canyon floor far below. Instinctively, she reached out and managed to grab onto the thick root of an ancient pine tree that protruded from the cliff face about 20 feet down. The sudden stop sent a shock of pain through her shoulders and arms, but she held on desperately. Her legs dangled freely in the air, and when she looked down, she could see the rocky canyon floor hundreds of feet below. The root that saved her life was strong, but Sarah could feel it shifting slightly under her weight. Small pieces of dirt and rock fell from around the root system as she hung there, and she realized that her time was limited. The root might hold for a while, but it wouldn't support her forever. Sarah tried to swing her legs toward the cliff face to find a foothold, but the rock wall was smooth and offered nothing to grip. Her heavy pack, which contained all her emergency equipment, had shifted during the fall and was now pulling her backward, making it even harder to maintain her grip on the route. She attempted to reach for her radio with one hand, but the moment she loosened her grip, she could feel herself slipping. The radio remained clipped to her shoulder, completely useless while she was hanging upside down with both hands occupied, keeping herself alive. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. She carried rope, climbing gear, and emergency equipment, but all of it was useless when she couldn't let go of the route to access it. She had trained for many emergency scenarios during her years as a ranger, but hanging upside down from a cliff face had never been covered in any manual. As minutes passed, Sarah's arms began to ache from supporting her full body weight, plus the heavy pack. She tried to calculate how long she could hold on. Her physical fitness was excellent, but hanging from her arms was different from any exercise she had ever done. The burning sensation in her shoulders and forearms was getting worse with each passing moment. She looked around desperately for any other option. The cliff face above her was too far to reach, and the canyon floor below was certain death. The root system of the pine tree extended in several directions, but the other roots were either too small to support her weight or too far away to reach safely. Sarah began calling for help, shouting as loudly as she could, but she knew the chances of being heard were slim. This remote area of the park rarely saw visitors, especially early in the morning. The other rangers were following their own patrol routes miles away, and her radio check-in wasn't scheduled for another 2 hours. The wind picked up, causing the pine tree above her to sway slightly. Each movement sent vibrations through the root system, and Sarah could feel the dirt around the root loosening further. She realized that even if the root could support her weight indefinitely, the tree itself might not remain anchored to the cliff face for much longer. As her grip began to weaken, Sarah started to think about her family. Her parents lived in Colorado and expected her to visit next month for her father's birthday. Her sister had just announced her engagement and wanted Sarah to be the maid of honor. The thought of never seeing them again gave her a surge of determination, and she tightened her grip on the root despite the pain in her arms. But determination could only carry her so far. Sarah could feel her strength fading, and she knew she couldn't hold on much longer. The morning sun was beginning to heat up the canyon, and sweat was making her hands slippery. She tried to adjust her grip to get a better hold, but each movement made her situation more precarious. Just as Sarah began to think that her strength would give out completely, she heard something that made her heart race with hope. It was the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Someone was riding along the trail below, though she couldn't see who it might be. She began shouting for help again, putting every ounce of energy she had left into her calls for assistance. The hoofbeats stopped, and Sarah held her breath, listening for any sign that her calls had been heard. The canyon was quiet except for the wind through the pine trees and her own labored breathing. Then she heard something that filled her with both hope and confusion. The sound of a horse moving closer to the cliff face directly below her position. Sarah looked down and saw something that seemed impossible. A massive dark brown horse was standing at the base of the cliff, looking up at her with what appeared to be genuine concern in its intelligent eyes. The horse was alone, with no rider in sight, and it seemed to be studying her situation with an almost human-like understanding of her predicament. The horse began moving back and forth below her, occasionally looking up and making soft, nickering sounds. Sarah had worked around horses during her childhood on her grandfather's ranch, and she recognized the behavior as the animal trying to communicate. But what could a wild horse possibly do to help her in this situation? As her strength continued to fade and her grip on the root became more tenuous, Sarah realized that this magnificent animal might be her only hope. But how could a horse possibly help someone hanging from a cliff face? The answer to that question would soon prove more remarkable than she could have ever imagined. The horse below Sarah was unlike any wild Mustang she had ever seen. Standing at least 17 hands high, the animal was powerfully built with a glossy, dark brown coat that shone in the morning sunlight. Its mane was long and thick, flowing in the canyon breeze, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. What struck Sarah as most unusual was the horse's behavior. Instead of running away from the strange situation, the animal remained perfectly calm and appeared to be analyzing the problem. The horse walked in a wide circle beneath Sarah's position, occasionally stopping to look up at her and make gentle sounds that seemed intended to be reassuring. Sarah's arms were burning with fatigue, and she could feel her grip loosening despite her best efforts to hold on. She estimated that she had been hanging from the root for nearly 20 minutes, and her strength was fading rapidly. The morning sun was getting higher, and sweat was beginning to make her hands even more slippery. The horse seemed to sense her growing desperation. It moved closer to the base of the cliff and began pawing at the ground with its front hooves. At first, Sarah thought the animal was simply nervous, but then she realized something extraordinary was happening. The horse was deliberately digging in the rocky soil at the base of the cliff. As Sarah watched in amazement, the horse used its powerful hooves to move rocks and loose soil, creating what appeared to be a small depression in the ground. The animal worked methodically, pausing occasionally to look up at Sarah, as if checking her condition before returning to its task. But even more remarkable than the digging was what the horse did next. After several minutes of moving rocks and soil, the animal began gathering fallen branches and pieces of dead wood in its mouth. The horse would pick up a branch, carry it to the depression it had created, and drop it carefully in place. Then it would return to search for more material. Sarah could hardly believe what she was seeing. The horse was building some kind of cushioning platform directly beneath her dangling position. The animal seemed to understand that if Sarah fell, the impact with the rocky ground would be fatal, and it was trying to create something that might soften her landing. The intelligence displayed by this remarkable animal was beyond anything Sarah had learned about horse behavior during her childhood or her ranger training. Wild horses were known to be clever and adaptable, but this level of problem-solving and apparent empathy was extraordinary. As the horse continued its work, Sarah tried once more to reach her radio, but the movement nearly caused her to lose her grip entirely. She quickly returned both hands to the root and concentrated on holding on for as long as possible. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire, and she could feel the root shifting more noticeably under her weight. The horse must have noticed her increased distress because it began working even more quickly. The animal had gathered an impressive pile of branches, dead wood, and even some dried grass and leaves. Using its muzzle and hooves, the horse arranged the materials into a thick, springy pile that covered an area several feet in diameter. But the horse wasn't finished. After completing its makeshift landing pad, the animal began making loud, whinnying calls that echoed off the canyon walls. The sounds were different from its earlier gentle nickering. These were clearly distress calls, meant to carry over long distances. Sarah realized that the horse was calling for help. Just as she had shouted for human assistance, this intelligent animal was using its own voice to alert any other horses or humans in the area to the emergency situation. The calls were rhythmic and persistent, repeating every few seconds with an urgency that seemed to understand the time-sensitive nature of the crisis. Between calls, the horse continued to improve its rescue preparations. It used its teeth to grab larger pieces of fallen wood and drag them into position around the landing area. The animal even seemed to test the springiness of its construction by pressing down on different sections with its hooves and adjusting the arrangement of materials. Sarah's vision was beginning to blur from the strain of hanging upside down, and she could feel her heart racing from both exertion and fear. The blood pooling in her head was making her dizzy, and she knew she couldn't maintain her grip much longer. But seeing the horse's determined efforts to help her gave her strength to hold on a little longer. The horse's distress calls were answered sooner than expected. Sarah heard the distant sound of more hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the main trail. The horse below her heard them too, and increased the volume and frequency of its calls, clearly communicating the urgency of the situation to the approaching animals. Within minutes, 2 more horses appeared at the edge of the canyon. One was a smaller chestnut mare, and the other was a large black stallion. But what shocked Sarah even more than their arrival was what happened next. All 3 horses began communicating with each other through a series of whinnies, snorts, and body language that seemed far more sophisticated than typical horse behavior. The chestnut mare immediately began helping to improve the landing area, using her hooves to pack down the materials and add more cushioning. The black stallion, meanwhile, began moving in ever-widening circles around the area, clearly searching for something. Sarah watched in fascination as the stallion disappeared briefly into the forest and then returned carrying something in his mouth. It was a long, sturdy rope, the kind used by ranchers and park maintenance crews. The rope must have been dropped or abandoned by workers in the area, and the intelligent stallion had somehow understood that it could be useful in the current situation. The 3 horses gathered around the rope, and what followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. The large brown horse that had first discovered her took one end of the rope in its mouth, while the other 2 horses positioned themselves to help guide and support the rescue attempt. The brown horse began backing away from the cliff, pulling the rope taut, but Sarah quickly realized that simply throwing the rope up to her would be impossible. She couldn't release her grip on the root to catch it, and the horses had no way to throw it high enough anyway. Instead, the horses seemed to have developed a different plan. The brown horse carefully positioned the rope near the base of the cliff, while the black stallion began backing up toward a large boulder that sat about 50 feet away from the cliff face. The chestnut mare remained near the landing area, continuing to improve the cushioning materials. Sarah watched in growing amazement as the black stallion climbed onto the boulder, which was nearly 6 feet high. From this elevated position, the powerful animal was able to see Sarah clearly and began making direct eye contact with her. The horse's expression seemed to be trying to communicate something important. The stallion then did something that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about horse behavior. Using its teeth, the animal grabbed the free end of the rope and began swinging its head back and forth to build momentum. After several practice swings, the stallion hurled the rope end toward Sarah's position with remarkable accuracy. The rope fell short of reaching Sarah, but it came much closer than she would have thought possible. More importantly, it showed her that these remarkable animals had developed a plan that went far beyond simply creating a soft landing area. They were actively trying to establish a rescue line that could help her either climb down safely or at least control her descent. The horses repeated this process several times, with each attempt getting the rope a little closer to Sarah's position. The brown horse and chestnut mare repositioned themselves to help guide the rope's path, while the stallion continued to refine his throwing technique from atop the boulder. During one particularly good throw, the rope end landed on a rocky ledge about 10 feet below Sarah's position. The brown horse immediately noticed this and began pulling the rope to keep it taut, while making excited sounds that seemed to be encouraging Sarah to attempt some kind of movement. Sarah realized that if she could somehow swing her body toward the ledge where the rope had landed, she might be able to grab it and use it to control her descent. But making such a movement would require her to shift her weight and potentially release her grip on the root, an extremely risky proposition given her weakened condition. The root she was clinging to gave another ominous crack, and more dirt fell away from around its base. Sarah knew she was running out of time and options. The horses seemed to sense her predicament and began making more urgent sounds, as if trying to encourage her to take the risk while she still had enough strength to attempt it. As Sarah contemplated this terrifying decision, she heard something that changed everything, the distant sound of human voices. The horses' distress calls had apparently been heard not just by other horses but by people as well. Someone was coming, But would they arrive in time? And would they be able to help where the horses had not yet succeeded? The large brown horse seemed to hear the voices too, and began calling even more loudly, clearly trying to guide the humans to the correct location. The animal's intelligence and determination had been remarkable, but now the rescue attempt was about to involve the one species that might actually be able to save Sarah's life. The question was whether Sarah could hold on long enough for human help to arrive, or whether she would have to trust her life to the incredible plan that these three extraordinary horses had developed. As her strength continued to fade and the route showed more signs of giving way, Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine whether she lived or died, and that her survival might depend on a level of interspecies cooperation that few people would ever believe possible. The voices that Sarah heard belonged to Dr. James Whitfield, a veterinarian who had been called to the area to treat an injured Mustang, and Tom Rodriguez, a local rancher who served as a volunteer search and rescue coordinator. They had been following a trail of horse tracks when they heard the persistent distress calls echoing through the canyon. When the two men arrived at the cliff edge, they were stunned by what they found. Below them, 3 horses had clearly organized a rescue operation unlike anything either man had ever witnessed. The large brown horse was positioned near the base of the cliff, holding a rope in its mouth while maintaining visual contact with Sarah. The black stallion remained on the boulder, ready to attempt another throw, while the chestnut mare continued to arrange cushioning materials. Tom immediately recognized the horses as members of a wild herd that ranged through this section of the park. What he couldn't understand was how they had found a rope, and more importantly, how they seemed to understand its potential use in a rescue operation. The level of cooperation and problem-solving he was witnessing challenged everything he thought he knew about equine behavior. Dr. Whitfield was equally amazed, but his immediate concern was for Sarah. Through his binoculars, he could see that she was weakening rapidly and that the route supporting her was showing signs of failing. He estimated that she had been hanging for nearly an hour, far longer than most people could maintain such a position. Tom quickly radioed for additional rescue personnel and equipment, but he knew that by the time a full rescue team arrived with proper gear, it might be too late. The nearest rescue station was 45 minutes away, and Sarah clearly didn't have that much time left. The brown horse seemed to sense the urgency of the new arrivals and began making different sounds, almost as if it was trying to communicate the details of the situation to the humans. The animal moved back and forth between the rope and the cushioned area it had created, then looked up at the men as if seeking their approval or assistance. Dr. Whitfield had spent his career studying animal behavior, and what he was observing defied scientific explanation. These horses were displaying cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence that suggested a level of consciousness far beyond what was documented in any veterinary textbook. Tom, meanwhile, was focused on the immediate problem. As an experienced rancher and rescue volunteer, he could see that the horses had actually developed a workable plan. The rope they had found was strong enough to support Sarah's weight, and if they could somehow get it to her, she might be able to use it to control her descent to the cushioned landing area the horses had prepared. But the challenge remained the same, one the horses had been struggling with: how to get the rope high enough for Sarah to reach. Tom examined the cliff face and realized that there was a narrow ledge system that ran along the side of the canyon. If someone could traverse that ledge, they might be able to get close enough to Sarah's position to help her. However, attempting such a traverse without proper climbing equipment would be extremely dangerous. Tom was an experienced climber, but the rock face was crumbly and unstable, as evidenced by the very collapse that had put Sarah in danger in the first place. While Tom studied the cliff face, Dr. Whitfield continued to observe the horse's behavior. The brown horse appeared to be growing agitated, moving restlessly and making increasingly urgent sounds. The animal seemed to understand that time was running out and that a new approach was needed. Suddenly, the brown horse did something that left both men speechless. The animal walked over to Tom, gently took hold of his jacket sleeve with its teeth, and began pulling him toward the boulder where the black stallion waited. The horse's intentions were unmistakable. It wanted Tom to climb onto the boulder and help with the rope throwing attempt. Tom had worked with horses his entire life, but he had never experienced anything like this level of direct communication and cooperation. The animal was clearly trying to enlist his help in a specific way, understanding that human abilities might succeed where equine efforts had fallen short. With Dr. Whitfield steadying him, Tom climbed onto the boulder beside the black stallion. The magnificent animal moved aside to give Tom more room, but remained close enough to help. Tom took the rope that the brown horse brought to him and quickly tied a small loop in one end to make it easier for Sarah to grab. From the elevated position on the boulder, Tom had a much better angle and considerably more throwing strength than the horses had possessed. His first throw sent the rope arcing high through the air, and it landed on the rocky ledge just a few feet below Sarah's position. Sarah saw the rope land near her and felt a surge of hope, but she also faced the terrifying reality of what came next. To reach the rope, she would have to swing her body toward the cliff face and grab for it with one hand while maintaining her grip on the root with the other. If she missed, or if the movement caused the root to break, she would fall to certain death. The brown horse seemed to sense her hesitation and began making gentle, encouraging sounds. The animal's voice had a calming quality that somehow gave Sarah confidence. Looking down at the carefully constructed landing area and seeing the determined faces of her rescuers, both human and equine, Sarah knew she had to try. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began swinging her body back and forth to build momentum. Each swing brought her closer to the rocky ledge where the rope waited. The root creaked ominously with each movement, and she could feel it shifting in the cliff face. On her fourth swing, Sarah released her left hand from the root and lunged for the rope. Her fingers closed around the thick fibers just as the root gave way completely with a loud crack. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah's entire weight was supported by her one-handed grip on the rope, and she could feel herself slipping. But Tom had anticipated this moment and had braced himself on the boulder with the help of both Dr. Whitfield and the black stallion, which had positioned itself to help support Tom's weight. The rope held firm, and Sarah managed to get her other hand around it as well. What followed was a carefully coordinated descent that involved all 5 beings working together. Tom controlled the rope from above, allowing Sarah to descend slowly while the 3 horses positioned themselves below to guide her away from rocky outcroppings and toward the soft landing area they had prepared. The brown horse was particularly active during the descent, moving back and forth to stay directly beneath Sarah and making sounds that seemed intended to guide her movements. When Sarah's boots finally touched the cushioned surface the horses had created, all 3 animals moved in close as if to ensure she was safe. Sarah collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. Her arms and shoulders were in agony from the prolonged hanging, and she was severely dehydrated. But she was alive, thanks to the most extraordinary rescue effort she had ever heard of. Dr. Whitfield immediately began checking Sarah for injuries, while Tom radioed to update the incoming rescue team on the successful extraction. But both men were clearly struggling to process what they had just witnessed. As Dr. Whitfield treated Sarah's rope burns and examined her for signs of more serious injury, the 3 horses remained close by, as if they wanted to ensure that their rescue efforts had been successful. The brown horse in particular seemed reluctant to leave, occasionally nuzzling Sarah gently and making soft sounds that seemed intended to be comforting. When the full rescue team arrived with paramedics and proper medical equipment, they found Sarah in stable condition, but suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and muscle strain. The medics were amazed that someone who had hung from a cliff for over an hour had sustained such relatively minor injuries. But what amazed them even more were the stories they heard from Tom and Dr. Whitfield about the horses' role in the rescue. The paramedics examined the landing area and confirmed that the cushioning materials had been arranged with remarkable precision and understanding of what would be needed to break a fall safely. As Sarah was being prepared for transport to the hospital, she insisted on saying goodbye to her equine rescuers. The brown horse allowed her to stroke its neck and seemed to understand her words of gratitude. The intelligence and compassion in the animal's eyes were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Dr. Whitfield documented everything he had witnessed and later published a paper about the incident in a veterinary behavior journal. His findings challenged conventional understanding of equine intelligence and cooperation abilities. The paper became one of the most widely cited studies in animal behavior research. Tom Rodriguez, meanwhile, worked with park officials to ensure that the 3 horses would be protected and monitored. DNA testing revealed that the brown horse was actually not a wild Mustang at all, but a domestic horse that had escaped from a ranch several months earlier. The animal's training and human interaction history helped explain some of its remarkable problem-solving abilities, but not the level of cross-species empathy it had displayed. The black stallion and chestnut mare were confirmed to be wild horses, but their behavior during the rescue suggested a level of social learning and cooperation that researchers had never documented before. The incident led to new studies of wild horse intelligence and social structures. Sarah returned to work 3 weeks later, physically recovered but emotionally changed by her experience. She requested assignment to the area where the rescue had occurred and became an unofficial guardian of the 3 horses that had saved her life. The brown horse, whom Sarah named Guardian, eventually allowed himself to be recaptured and returned to domesticated life. But he was placed in a special program where his intelligence and abilities could be studied and appreciated rather than simply used for labor. The Park Service installed new safety barriers and warning systems around Devil's Overlook, and Sarah became a powerful advocate for wildlife protection and habitat preservation. She often told the story of her rescue to visiting groups, emphasizing the remarkable intelligence and emotional capacity of the horses that had saved her life. 6 months after the incident, Sarah was honored at a ceremony attended by animal behaviorists, park officials, and rescue personnel. But the guests who meant the most to her were Guardian, the black stallion, and the chestnut mare, who were brought to the ceremony so she could publicly thank them one more time. The story of Sarah's rescue spread far beyond the Park Service and became a widely shared example of the extraordinary bonds that can exist between humans and animals. It challenged people to reconsider their assumptions about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. Dr. Whitfield's research, inspired by what he witnessed that day, led to breakthrough discoveries about equine cognitive abilities and contributed to improved training methods for therapy horses and rescue animals. The incident proved that animals are capable of compassion, problem-solving, and cooperation at levels that science had never fully recognized. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was personal. Her experience hanging from that cliff, utterly dependent on the intelligence and compassion of 3 horses, had given her a profound appreciation for the interconnectedness of all living beings. She knew that she owed her life not just to human technology and expertise, but to the remarkable hearts and minds of animals who had seen her in distress and chosen to help. The bond between Sarah and Guardian continued for many years, with regular visits that strengthened both of them. And whenever Sarah told the story of her rescue, she always emphasized that the true heroes of that day had been 3 horses who displayed intelligence, cooperation, and compassion that exceeded what anyone thought possible. Their extraordinary efforts had not only saved her life, but had opened new doors to understanding the remarkable abilities of the animals that share our world. In the end, Sarah's terrifying ordeal had become a gift that enriched the lives of countless humans and animals who benefited from the new knowledge and appreciation that emerged from one horse's decision to help a stranger in desperate need.